Hi again then guys, and welcome to another specific car review from the newly debuted 1.11 patch on Gran Turismo Sport, and this time we're featuring another definite standout of the pack, a car which I know plenty of people are very happy to see back, both from comments and also just in a general sense. It's the kind of car that you know people are going to be happy about, the McLaren F1. Now, we have discussed the McLaren F1 on the channel before, from Gran Turismo 6 of course, and in that review I discussed, as I did with all cars back then, and I still do for Gran Turismo 6, the vehicle's fully tuned potential. But when it comes to these revisited reviews on Gran Turismo Sport, the way we review the cars and look at them and discuss them is slightly different, because on Gran Turismo 6 it was all about what the peak potential of those cars were. That's the whole point of why I review the cars in their fully tuned form. It's so that people don't have to pay out all that money to buy every car to find the best ones. On GT Sport, on the other hand, it's not really the same deal, because the cars are fewer, the accuracy of the performance is better than Gran Turismo 6, and so the kind of parameters that you can judge a car by do change. In fact, you could say they get a little bit closer to the real world, so you can judge things like handling and authenticity of feel, not just in terms of handling, but also the sound, the look, the vibe that the car has, and how close to real life it feels, much more so than you can with GT6. Even if you haven't driven the car, you can just get that more real-world vibe from it. And I would say that the McLaren F1 is a great example of that from this pack, because the bar is really high when it comes to a car like this. When you have something come into the game like a new premium Supra, which of course we already discussed, everyone is probably going to be happy with it. Even if it doesn't turn out to be anywhere near as good as Gran Turismo 6, many people wouldn't even mind that. Just having the car back is good enough for them, and I can understand that mentality. For me, for instance, that would be like the Renault Espace F1 returning, but not being the best car in the game. Whereas on Gran Turismo 2, it was at least top 5, maybe even top 3, I would say possibly even the best all-round car in the game in terms of what it could do. However, if it were to come back, it most likely wouldn't be the best in the game anymore, because we now have things like Formula cars in the franchise. So I wouldn't be disappointed by that, because just having the car back would be good enough. So for vehicles like the Supra, they have that fan favourite advantage. With the McLaren, it's a little bit different, because although it is certainly a fan favourite, especially within the supercar world, the standard that we hold a McLaren F1 to is much higher. Now, Supra fans will disagree with that, but I'm talking in a general sense. For people who aren't super fans of the McLaren or something like a Supra, you expect a lot from a car like this, because it's just a whole nother level. In fact, when it was released, and for a number of years after, some would even argue to this day, it's the benchmark of what a supercar can and should be. And in fact, the McLaren was so good when it was released that even by today's standards, if you're putting it up against stuff like the Porsche 918, the LaFerrari, etc., it's still as impressive now as it was back then. In fact, I would argue that the McLaren is more impressive now than it was when it was released, because if you compare the spec of this car and many of the features and design cues, both inside and out, that it used, it was a revolutionary car, and one that was so far ahead of its time that it makes something like, say, an XJ220 or a Diablo look primitive in comparison. And they are great cars, but to make them look like basic supercars, that's a big deal. And that is how good the McLaren was. There is, after all, a reason why Porsche used the McLaren to develop the Carrera GT, or why Bugatti used it to develop the Veyron. It is the benchmark of supercars, especially when you're talking top-tier supercars. And in the real world, the performance, in particular the top-end speed which they got out of it, was incredible. And that's one of the main reasons why I think to this day it's such an impressive car, because the initial speed record was 231, then they raised it to just over 240, and in a two-way speed test, McLaren even got it up to 243 by raising the rev limiter. That is incredible. From a 626 horsepower, naturally aspirated engine no less. Today, most supercars are hybrids or twin-turbo or twin-supercharged even in some cases, such as Koenigsegg or Zenvo for instance with its twin-charge system. But this naturally aspirated, BMW-powered relatively small British supercar from the early 90s is still so fast, even now. So how does it feel in Gran Turismo Sport? Does it still manage to keep that? Or is it the same? Or is it perhaps worse? Has it been neutered somewhat to make it feel more competitive? Because after all, this is an N600 class car, and with the new class ratings of GT Sport, that is a completely different ballgame to on Gran Turismo 6, because on GT6, with the PP system, this car would be much higher, as it was, whereas now, you can take this thing up against the MP4, which doesn't seem like a fair battle. It can be, of course, especially if you start comparing it to stuff like the MP412C or some others, but when you start factoring in stuff like tuned Mustangs and Camaros and Chargers in that same class, or even Supras and Skylines, that starts to seem a little bit unfair. Well, I have to say, if you are a McLaren F1 fan, and you haven't driven the car yet, maybe you don't have the credits to buy it yet, maybe you don't even have the game yet, but you're just watching this video to check out the car, I can guarantee one thing: if you are a McLaren F1 fan, you're not going to be disappointed, because I would say that possibly of any game I've ever driven, GT Sport so far is the best representation of a McLaren F1 in any game that I've driven it on. And I've driven the McLaren F1 in a lot of games. On Forza, Gran Turismo, I believe it was on Drive Club, but I can't recall if it was or not. I believe a version of it was on there at least, it may have been the LM. Test Drive Unlimited even, there are plenty of games to feature it, but this feels the most authentic. It feels like a legend. The handling is not beginner friendly, but at the same time, it's not difficult to drive. It's a car which will bite back, but you also know exactly where you are at all times. You know what the car's going to do. You can pretty easily counter any kind of mistake that you might make through a corner and just hold it through a drift, or just slow down a little bit, or even just use careful old school throttle control, because at the end of the day, the McLaren F1 is a supercar which I have a lot of respect for one particular reason, and that is it feels like a very analog supercar. It feels very mechanical, very old school. It's basically the pinnacle of old school thinking, if you look at it that way. It's like an old school formula car, but it doesn't have all of the hybrid and EV tech of a modern supercar or hypercar, and yet I think it's all the better for it, because this car doesn't need any of that. This is a raw supercar, and for a car that is so raw, and is the literal definition of a race car for the road, something that you can drive to a race, win, and drive home again, it's a remarkably forgiving car. It is still the benchmark as far as Gran Turismo Sport goes for its age at the very least, and if the XJ220 comes back, we can have some pretty good battles between this, that XJ220, and of course the F40. So if you haven't checked out the McLaren yet, definitely do so, and it also sounds fantastic. But that's it overall for this particular pick. Of course, I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.